This is the AYANEO Pocket DMG, or as I like to call it, the Pocket OMG, because good Lord, this might, you know what, not might, that's not fair to it. This is absolutely 100% the finest retro handheld that I have ever laid my hands on, and it better be because it is also expensive as hell. That said, I don't think it's overpriced. I think it's just premium. It's the Cadillac of retro handhelds, and I absolutely love it. I know it seems like we are constantly getting new retro handhelds all of the time. Quite often, many of them are the same. It'll be the same chipset or the same screen or just slight variations on a theme. And while I love all of those devices, I think that this one is something special, but it's not perfect. So let's talk about my experience with the Pocket DMG, after I've used it for about a week. Okay, let's talk about what you get with the Pocket DMG. It has a few different SKUs. The lowest one with 8 gigs of LPDDR5X RAM and 128 gigs of storage. That comes in Arctic Black or Moon White, and it costs $453. Or if you pre-order it, you get a discount down to $342. And it goes all the way from that price up to 16 gigs of RAM with 1 terabyte of storage. That one comes in at a whopping $700 or $675 on pre-sale. That's the one that they sent me. This is also the only one that has the Retro Color Limited Edition, which is supposed to mimic the original Game Boy DMG. I do find it kind of annoying that they're locking a color behind the higher price tier, but I also think that the black ones and the white ones look really, really fantastic. Now, I can hear your keyboards clacking away as I tell you about these prices. Bill, why would anyone pay that much for a retro handheld when you can get a device that can play these same games for like $50? And honestly, I can totally understand that argument. But I think an analog that I would look at for this would be a really nice fishing boat. Sure, I can hop in a canoe and catch the same fish that I could find in a fancy fishing boat, but the fishing boat comes with all of these great bells and whistles that makes the experience different. I don't know that I would say better, but absolutely different. And some people will prefer the fishing boat for all of those bells and whistles, but other people will prefer the canoe just so that they can get more in touch with the nature. Does that make sense? I think that these devices are for different people. And if you have disposable income and you want to have the best possible retro handheld, I think that this one is probably the one to get. The chipset driving it is the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2. The CPU has 8 cores and it has 1 gigahertz GPU with performance cap of up to 15 watts, which is the same wattage that's in the Steam Deck. This is pretty much top of the line right now when it comes to Android, and good God, it is going to handle almost anything that you want to try and throw at it. You're looking at very few compromises here, which is good considering how expensive this retro handheld is. I keep saying retro handheld. I know it's a full-on Android device, but I don't really use Android devices for Android devicey things, so I just want to focus on the retro stuff here. This chip is powerful and efficient, which makes the battery life on this ridiculously good, especially thanks to the 6,000 milliamp hour battery that they put in this. I'd go so far as to say that most people using this, as a retro device, normal use could go a day or two without charging this and use it a lot. And they would never really have to worry about battery life if they're using it like a retro handheld. I'm having trouble saying that. It has a built-in fan to keep the Snapdragon chip cool. The intake is on the back and the vent is on the top. It also has its best feature is this screen. The screen is gorgeous. It's this ridiculous 3.9-inch OLED screen with a resolution of 1240 by 1080. This brings the pixels per inch of the screen up to 419 ppi. There are so many pixels jammed onto this OLED screen that you don't even really need to worry about integer scaling. Even with integer scaling off, using no filters and no shaders and no overlays, loading up Mega Man X for the Super Nintendo and looking at Mega Man's health bar, I personally would have a hard time telling the difference between integer scaling and not, other than integer scaling would have a slightly smaller picture. I don't have a macro lens, but I zoomed in as much as I possibly could, and this is what it looks like with integer scaling turned on. And this is what it looks like with integer scaling turned off. That said, even though the PPI on this screen means that you can run your older games at nearly full screen and not really have to worry about balanced pixels, I still personally like to add in shaders and overlays to make things look a little more nostalgic. I really like adding in a CRT glow effect that makes things look like I'm playing on a CRT machine, even if that's not the way that they played back in the day, like if I'm playing an old Game Boy game or something. If you had any retro handheld, I highly recommend you check out Retro Game Core's guide on shaders and overlays. Russ did a fantastic job on this, and for those of you that don't know, he is a regular on the NerdNest podcast, so make sure that you subscribe here so you can see us talk about video games each and every week. We're actually getting together to talk about games tomorrow. Back to the screen, because this is an OLED display with up to 500 nits of brightness. This thing looks great in almost any lighting condition. In full brightness, I could still play outside on a clear day. It isn't ideal, but I can. Inside, I usually keep it at about 20% brightness. It doesn't dim all the way down to black as I would like, which I would wish it would do for when I'm scraping files from Screen Scraper for hours and hours. I don't like having the display on when I do that. But then again, scraping is something that you really only have to do once or twice on a device like this, and then you get to move on. Speaking of moving on, let's move on to the software. This is an Android device, so it isn't running a custom operating system like most of my retro handhelds are. I have to admit, I very much prefer Linux-based operating system for these kinds of devices, but there are certain things that were way easier to set up because this is Android. First of all, it has a built-in web browser, so if you want to sideload things that you don't normally have to load onto the SD card and then transfer it that way, you could just log in via Chrome. All your bookmarks are there. It makes getting to certain shaders and files and stuff like that just really easily. AYANEO also loaded their own front end onto it. I tried it a bit, but I don't really like it, but it's not really a problem because you don't have to use it. You can use any front end you would normally use on Android. In fact, I went through and set up Daigisho the way that I usually do on Android devices, but then I decided after I had it all done and working that I wanted to give Emulation Station a try on this. The setup process to get Emulation Station running on this was incredibly easy, and I think my Daigisho days are now behind me. I do want to point out that Emulation Station is paid. You can't get it through the Google Play Store for whatever reason, but you can get their APK through Patreon, and it's just a one-time purchase, and then they'll send you all of the updates through email. Sideloading it was incredibly easy, and I've been using Emulation Station for years, so it was very familiar to me once I got everything set up. But back to the pre-installed software. AYANEO also has a utility that comes on this where whenever you press the Aya button in the bottom right, it gives you access to a bunch of really handy options. This works, by the way, even if you're not using their front end, so you can use whatever front end you like, and you still have access to all of these widgets. The top one is performance, and it's going to tell you your current frames per second, as well as the fan speed, how much CPU and GPU you're using, the ability to quickly switch between performance modes, and the ability to have an on-screen frames per second, data table that tells you everything that's going on with the device while you're playing a game. Really cool stuff. 99% of the time I've been using this device, I've been using it in the battery saver power mode, giving you, I'm going to say, all day battery life. If anything gets a little choppy, I can easily switch over to the balance mode, which does use just a little bit more power. The times that I needed to do this were very few and far between, but your mileage may vary depending on what kinds of games you want to emulate on this thing. Here you can see that I'm playing Champions of Narath on PS2 using a 2x resolution upscale, and it's handling it no problem. This is using the balanced mode. Underneath the performance tab, we have the controller options. You can swap your ABXY button from Xbox style to Nintendo style, depending on your preferences. You can turn on gyro here, as well as change a few other things about your controls. Next is the handheld tab, which is where you can toggle Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, airplane mode, brightness, volume. You can turn the RGB on or off that sits underneath that I button. I turned mine off right away because I don't like a RGB on my devices. Then there are more toggles and widgets underneath there. And finally, quick access to a bunch of different settings. I really like this UI. The one thing I will point out is I tend to use it as a touch device, because whenever I toggle the menu and then I try to interact with it through the D-pad and the buttons, my inputs happen in that menu, but they also happen behind the menu in whatever app I happen to have open. So for example, let's say I have Emulation Station open and I'm pressing a bunch of buttons on the widgets menu. All of those things are also happening in Emulation Station, so I'm doing a bunch of stuff that I didn't actually mean to do. So it's just easier to press that button on the bottom right and then use your finger on the touch screen in order to swap anything around. If AYANEO could make it so that it would just capture those things in the widget instead of allowing the D-pad and buttons to go through to the app behind it, that would be way better. Let's talk about hardware now, starting with the D-pad. I've not used an AYANEO handheld device before, so I don't know if this is a design that they usually go with for D-pads, but I do like it a lot. I don't feel like I have to press really hard on it. It feels responsive, but not super loud and clicky. It is fantastic at the contour test, where I press down on the D-pad and then I wiggle my thumb back and forth to see how many accidental diagonals I get, which is almost none. Moving on to Street Fighter, Hadoukens are easy to pull off, and Shoryukens, they're a bit more problematic. Not terrible, but overall I think that this D-pad is impressive. And before we move on to the face buttons, I just want to say I just put out a massive 45-minute video all about all the different controllers that I have here in the NerdNest. So if you are interested in picking up a new controller for your gaming stuff, make sure that you check that out, because I don't want you to buy the wrong controller. All right, back onto this. The face buttons have a very shallow press, but they actually feel really responsive. I personally prefer bigger buttons, not taller buttons, but bigger buttons. These are pretty well balanced size-wise when it comes to the size of the device. I think that they're pretty good. The start and select buttons are both on the same side of the device, which I hate for retro systems. I have so much muscle memory build up holding down the select with my left thumb and then doing other things for hotkeys with my right thumb in RetroArch. I can't stand it when I can't do that, but this is something that I think you could get used to. That said, even if you could get used to it, these particular buttons are pretty bad. They don't have enough travel and they're not clicky enough. They're kind of mushy, and I hate pressing them both at the same time using one thumb in order to kill games in RetroArch. It's a pain, not a fan. But they're also start and select buttons. How many times are you really pressing those in a day? It's not that much, and it's not that big of a deal. And of all of the buttons that are on this device, these are the only ones that I don't like. On the sides, we have extra buttons for Android. You've got menu buttons, multitasking buttons, and you also have a scroll wheel for volume control, which is really cool. And if you need to mute real quick, you could just click the scroll wheel in and it will automatically mute. Speaking of volume, most vertical handhelds have a tendency to put one speaker on the front of the device, but AYANEO decided to put the speakers on the side of the device, left on the left side, right on the right side, which gives you a little bit of stereo separation. I really like this as an option, and the speakers sound great. Here, give it a listen. Below the volume wheel is a performance switch. I don't really understand why this switch exists. I don't think I will ever use it again. It's a strange switch. You push up on it in order to toggle through different performance modes, but it's much easier just to press the AYA button on the bottom right and then choose which performance mode you want from the touch screen. On the right-hand side, you also have the power button, which is also your fingerprint reader. It works fantastically well, and I've never really had issues logging in. I'm always logged in almost instantaneously. And by the way, I will say a little helpful hint: if you do pick up one of these, Android, just like iOS, allows you to register more than one fingerprint. So I registered my right index finger, so when I'm holding the device like this, where is it, like this, I can log in instantaneously with my finger on the fingerprint sensor. Or I also did my right thumb, so if I'm holding it like this, it logs in right away as well. This thing, by the way, speaking of logging in and turning things on instantly, there is no waiting for boot times. It's just like a phone. You just press the power button and instantly turns on. Turn it off, walk away, come back, pick up right where you left off. This is a really good experience, and it's the way that I like to use my retro devices. On the back, we have our L1 and R1 buttons, as well as L2 and R2. When I first looked at it, I thought it was just one set of buttons, but L2 and R2 are on this bar in the middle. They work great, and I've had very few accidental inputs with them. I will say that I would have liked this device, like the device as a whole, to be just a little bit thicker, or to give me something to wrap my fingers around when I'm holding on to it. It's nice and it's great that it's thin, but just sometimes I kind of start to get fatigued when I'm playing for too long. Let's talk about the joysticks. And yes, I did say joysticks because it looks like there's just one joystick, but there's actually two. The left joystick is a Hall effect joystick, and it works really well. There's no cardinal snapping. There's no cardinal snapping happening here. Say that 5 times fast. I did put a thumbstick cap on it in order to make it just a little bit bigger, as by default it's kind of small. And then you have the right stick, which is a trackpad. This is great for camera control, but if you want to play a game that needs to aim with the right stick, this is not going to work well. And if that's the kind of game you want to play, I would highly recommend against getting this device and instead get something with 2 sticks. You'll thank me later. One thing that I am trying to figure out with that trackpad is if I can turn it into a trackball for old arcade games like Golden Tee, which I played a million times when I was a kid. My grandmother had a bar, and we would go there in the summertime, when she was working during the daytime. I would walk into that bar and I would play Donkey Kong in the arcade game that they had there. They also had Golden Tee. I would pop a quarter in and then slide that little trackball forward and play golf. It was awesome. If you have advice on how to turn a trackpad into a track ball for running arcade games in RetroArch, let me know in the comments section down below. I will really appreciate it. And if I figure it out on my own, I will talk about it on a future episode of the NerdNest podcast. By the way, if you want to watch the latest episode of the podcast, check it out right here, or maybe check out this video down here. YouTube seems to think it's perfect for you. From the NerdNest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, and thanks for watching.